No footprints. No farewell. No whisper where they went. Two small children swallowed by the dark. And the one person who might hold the answers? Gone too. What truly happened to Lily and Jack Sullivan? Why did their mother vanish from the search when the entire country was screaming their names? This isn't just another missing persons case filed away in a cold cabinet somewhere. This is a wound that hasn't closed. A question that refuses to be buried. A mirror held up to the darkest corners of what we choose not to see. Before we go any further, if you believe that every child deserves to be found, that silence should never be allowed to swallow the truth, then subscribe right now. Don't wait until the end, because by subscribing, you're not simply watching another true crime breakdown. You're planting your flag in a community that refuses to look away when children disappear. A community that keeps saying names even when the headlines move on. A community that fights for children like Lily and Jack Sullivan. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who cares. Drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from, because awareness doesn't just travel on its own. We carry it. Together, we become the voice that keeps their light burning. May 2nd, 2025. The Sullivan home in a quiet stretch of Nova Scotia sits still in the hours before sunrise. No alarm, no commotion, no witnesses stepping forward to say they saw something. Lily and Jack simply ceased to be there. No neighbor peered through a curtain at the right moment. No surveillance camera blinked at a passing silhouette. They were there, and then they weren't, as though the night had quietly folded them away. Within hours, the machinery of a full-scale search roared to life. Search and rescue teams poured into surrounding woodland, boots pressing into cold, damp earth, voices cutting through the morning mist, calling names into a forest that answered with nothing but wind. The mood was urgent, electric with fear and desperate hope. Then came the discovery that shifted everything. A torn pink blanket. One rag piece snagged on the rough bark of a tree near an old ATV trail. A second fragment caught in the undergrowth several feet away, fluttering like a distress signal no one knew how to decode. That blanket became the heartbeat of the search. A symbol of the children. Proof that something had passed through here. Something small and vulnerable. Helicopters carved low grids across the treetops. Drones hummed through the canopy, their cameras scanning the forest floor for any sign of movement, any shape that didn't belong. Volunteers fanned out through streams, ravines, and gullies, checking every depression in the soil, every shadow behind a fallen log. Every rustling branch became a hell breath, but the forest gave nothing back. As hours bled into days, the urgency sharpened into something harder and more frightening. The question was no longer just where are they, but what happened to them? Were Lily and Jack huddled somewhere, cold and frightened, waiting for someone to find them? Were they injured, unable to call out? Or had something darker intercepted them before the sun rose that morning, leaving behind nothing but a torn pink blanket and an unbearable silence? The search continued. The teams kept moving, but the answers stayed buried, just like the children. And while boots crunched through pine needles and drones buzzed overhead, something else was happening. Something quieter. Something that would eventually draw as much attention as the disappearance itself. A second absence was unfolding. Not in the woods, not on an ATV trail, but in the very center of where a mother should have been standing. Because Malia, the mother of Lily and Jack Sullivan, was disappearing too. And unlike the children, her disappearance was a choice. At least, that's what it looked like. The question of why would become the shadow that stretched across everything. The search, the investigation, the public's understanding of this case. All of it, eventually, would fall under that shadow. And it hasn't lifted yet. One day, that's all it took. Less than 24 hours after calling the police to report her children missing, Malia was gone. No tearful press conference staged in a driveway with photographs clutched to her chest. No trembling voice breaking over a microphone, begging the public for help. No footage of her standing shoulder to shoulder with search crew volunteers, scanning the tree line with desperate eyes. She gathered her youngest child, slipped away from the area, and did not come back. She did not come back. In virtually every high-profile child disappearance case, the parent becomes the anchor of the public search. They are the face on every news channel. They are the voice cracking on every radio broadcast. They stand in front of cameras, even when they can barely stand at all. Because the alternative, stepping back, feels unthinkable when your child is still missing. The public expects it. The media amplifies it. Law enforcement often quietly encourages it. Because a visible, grieving parent keeps pressure on the search, keeps eyes engaged, keeps tips flowing in. Malia did none of that. And in that vacuum she left behind, something dangerous began to grow. Suspicion doesn't need an invitation. It simply moves in when certainty moves out. People notice her absence the way you notice a missing wall in a room. Suddenly everything feels exposed. Online communities began dissecting her silence. Comment sections filled with questions that carried jagged edges. The RCMP issued no public criticism. The media tiptoed carefully around direct accusation. But the public? The public had already begun to ask the question out loud. Why would a mother walk away when her children are still missing? That question has no simple answer. But there are theories, and each one cuts from a different angle. The first theory asks us to pause before we judge. It asks us to look at Malia not as a figure of suspicion, but as a human being who may have been completely destroyed from the inside. Psychologists who study traumatic response describe something called reality refusal, a state where the mind, overwhelmed by unbearable circumstances, simply shuts down, not in anger, not in denial, but in total psychological collapse. The person doesn't scream. They don't bargain. They don't perform grief for cameras. They go quiet. They go still. They disappear into themselves because the alternative, which is fully feeling the weight of what has happened, would obliterate them entirely. Malia life before May 2nd carried its own invisible bruises. She was a single mother living off-grid, raising multiple young children under conditions of prolonged stress and isolation. The kind of life that doesn't get seen from the outside. The kind of weight that accumulates slowly, invisibly, until one catastrophic event becomes a breaking point that shatters everything underneath. What looks like suspicious withdrawal from the outside may, from the inside, be someone simply unable to breathe. This theory does not point a finger. It does not assign guilt. It simply asks whether the silence of a traumatized mother can be mistaken for the silence of a guilty one, and whether we are too quick to collapse the two into the same shape. Law enforcement never publicly described Malia as uncooperative. They noted her departure and moved forward. That restraint matters, because it suggests that, at least officially, her absence has not been treated as obstruction. And for some, that is a signal worth paying attention to. But not everyone is satisfied with compassion as an explanation, because the second theory presses harder. It doesn't ask us to forgive silence. It asks us to examine it. What if Malia didn't step back because she was broken, but because she was afraid? Not afraid of the cameras or the grief, but afraid of something she knew, something she saw, something that told her if she stood in front of a microphone and said too much, the consequences would be catastrophic. Criminologists call this complicit by silence. It doesn't require direct involvement in harm. It only requires knowledge, and a conscious decision to protect that knowledge instead of releasing it. And in the disappearance of Lily and Jack Sullivan, that distinction matters enormously. There's a name for what this theory describes: the passive protector. It sounds almost gentle when you say it out loud, but the reality it points to is anything but. A passive protector is someone who stands at the edge of the truth, close enough to see it clearly, but who chooses, for reasons that feel survival level urgent, to step back instead of forward. Not because they cause the harm, but because speaking about it feels more dangerous than staying silent. Think about what that silence would require. Imagine knowing something about where your children are, or what happened to them, and choosing not to say it. Not out of indifference, not out of cruelty, but out of a fear so absolute, so consuming, that it overrides even the most primal instinct a parent carries. The instinct to fight for your child at any cost. What kind of fear produces that result? It could be fear of retaliation. Someone in Malia's circle, someone with power over her, may have made it devastatingly clear that speaking to authorities carried a price she was not willing or not able to pay. It could be fear of destruction, the kind that comes from knowing that as she opens her mouth, whatever fragile structure remains of her life will collapse completely. It could even be fear of blame itself. The fear of standing in front of a country already suspicious of her and confessing to having seen something, knowing that the moment she does, she becomes a villain in a story that hasn't finished being written yet. In many cases of child disappearance where a parent later comes forward with delayed information, this is exactly the architecture of their silence. It was never about not caring. It was about being trapped inside a decision that felt impossible from every direction. The timeline in this case does not let that possibility rest quietly. On May 2nd, Malia called the police. That call matters. It was an act of someone reaching out, someone pulling the outside world in. But on May 3rd, she left. She took her youngest child and removed herself entirely from the landscape of the search. No return, no contact with the public, no voice added to the chorus of people screaming Lily and Jack's names into the dark. If she was the passive protector, then somewhere between that phone call and that departure, something shifted. Something changed what felt possible for her to do. And that shift, that pivot from reaching out to pulling away, is a crack in this theory that the public cannot stop staring into. We don't know what she knows. We don't know what she saw or heard in the hours and days before her children disappeared. We don't know what conversations happened inside that home, what threats were spoken or implied, what pressures have been building the silence of an off-grid life far from easy help or easy escape. What we do know is that her silence has not been neutral. In the absence of her voice, the investigation has had to move forward without the one witness who was closest to the children when they vanished. And that absence has a cost. It has a cost to the search. It has a cost to the families. It has a cost to Lily and Jack themselves, wherever they are right now. Before we go deeper, if this story is keeping you up at night the way it should be, share it right now. Copy the link and send it to someone who needs to know Lily and Jack's names. Leave a comment below telling us what you think happened, because every conversation this video sparks is another ripple of awareness moving through the world. Subscribe if you haven't already, because this community doesn't stop when the video ends. We keep pushing. We keep asking. We keep saying the names that others have started to forget. Lily Sullivan, Jack Sullivan, still missing, still waiting, still owed the truth. Now let's talk about the theory that no one wants to say out loud, but that history has forced us to take seriously. Because sometimes the most unbearable possibility is also the one that can no longer be avoided. There are cases burned into the public consciousness not because they were solved quickly, but because of what the solution revealed. Cases where the search, the vigils, the tearful press appearances, the community rallying behind a grieving parent, all of it eventually cracked open to expose something that rewired how people understood trust, love, and the unthinkable things human beings are capable of under unbearable pressure. Susan Smith told a nation that a stranger had carjacked her vehicle with her sons inside. She stood in front of cameras. She wept. The country searched. Then the truth arrived and shattered everything. Casey Anthony went 31 days without reporting her daughter, Kaylee, missing, constructing a layer of normalcy over a catastrophe, while investigators slowly pulled the threads apart. In both cases, the beginning looked the same. Confusion. Silence. A mother whose behavior didn't quite match the shape of the grief people expected to see. We are not saying Malia is Susan Smith. We are not saying she is Casey Anthony. The RCMP has not named her a suspect. No charges have been filed. No direct evidence has been placed before the public linking her to any act of harm against her children. That must be stated clearly and without hesitation. But the question that history keeps forcing us to ask is this. When the behavior of the person closest to missing children does not match what we expect, when the silence is too complete, when the departure is too clean, when the absence of public grief is too total, at what point does discomfort become a responsibility to look harder? The timeline is a thing people return to again and again. May 2nd, she calls the police. May 3rd, she leaves. No press appearances. No vigils. No public statements released through lawyers or advocates. No photographs held up in shaking hands. No voice added to the search. Just absence. Clean, unbroken, total absence. In cases where a parent has been directly involved in a child's disappearance, investigators consistently note that the behavior in the immediate aftermath often carries a particular texture. There is sometimes an overcorrection toward performed grief, and sometimes its opposite, a curious emotional flatness, a detachment that reads as wrong to everyone watching but that the person himself seems unable to calibrate. There is sometimes a removal from the center of the search, a stepping back that feels counterintuitive precisely because it goes against every instinct a loving parent is supposed to have. The darkest theory surrounding Malia's silence does not require malice as its engine. Investigators and psychologists who study familicide and child harm within domestic settings consistently point out that the most devastating cases are rarely driven by coldness. They are driven by collapse, by a mind fractured under the compounding weight of financial desperation, isolation, relationship trauma, mental health crises that went unseen and unsupported, and a moment, one terrible moment, where the pressure became too enormous and a decision was made that cannot be undone. An off-grid life, single parenthood, multiple young children, prolonged isolation. These are not excuses. They are not justifications. But they are the conditions that investigators look at when they try to understand how something unthinkable could happen inside a home that looked, from the outside, like just another family trying to survive. Again, there is no confirmation. There is no charge. There is no evidence made public that places Malia at the center of harm. But the shadow of this theory falls across the case regardless, because 2 children are missing and the person who was with them last has chosen complete silence in the aftermath. And silence, in the architecture of disappearance, is never truly neutral. It carries weight. It carries shape. It tells a story even when the mouth stays closed. What that story means in the case of Lily and Jack Sullivan, whether it points to guilt, fear, collapse, or something else entirely, is still unknown. But the not knowing is itself the wound that this investigation has not been able to close. And every day that passes without an answer makes that wound a little deeper, a little wider, a little harder to look away from. But what if everything we have been examining is wrong? What if the framework of suspicion that has built itself around Malia's silence is pointing in entirely the wrong direction? What if she didn't walk away from the search because she was broken or afraid or hiding something? What if she was removed? This theory requires a different kind of thinking. It requires us to step back from the instinct to assign guilt or collapse and consider instead the machinery that operates quietly behind high-profile investigations. Because that machinery exists. It has always existed, and it rarely announces itself. In cases where a witness holds information that is either too dangerous to speak publicly or too sensitive to risk being contaminated by media exposure, law enforcement agencies have the ability to move that person out of the public eye without fanfare, without press releases, and without explanation. No flashing lights, no dramatic escort, just a quiet conversation behind a closed door, a suggestion that becomes a directive, and a silent exit that the public interprets as abandonment. It has happened before in cases far less visible than this one. Witnesses relocated. Family members quietly advised to disappear from public view while investigations run their course underground. The absence that looks like guilt from the outside is sometimes, in reality, a carefully managed protective measure designed to keep both the witness and the integrity of the case intact. Now consider how the RCMP has handled Malia's departure publicly. They have not condemned it. They have not appealed to her on camera, asking her to return, to speak, to stand beside the search. They have not framed her silence as obstruction or her absence as suspicious behavior warranting public concern. Instead, there has been something notable in how they have handled it. A deliberate, sustained quiet, an absence of pressure that itself feels like a kind of pressure management. Could that quiet be strategic? Could it be that the investigators working this case know something about where Malia is and why she left that has not been released to the public? In active investigations involving missing children, authorities routinely withhold information specifically because releasing it could compromise the outcome they are working toward. What looks like a gap in the official narrative may in fact be a wall built deliberately to protect something still in motion. And then there's the other side of this theory, the darker edge of it. What if Malia's removal wasn't orchestrated by law enforcement at all? What if she was silenced not by authorities acting in her interests, but by someone acting in their own? A coercive presence, a figure within her circle who understood that if she spoke, something they needed kept hidden would surface. Someone who made it clear, in whatever language fear speaks most fluently, that her continued silence was not optional. This would reframe everything. Her departure would not be abandonment. It would be compliance under duress. Her silence would not be a choice freely made, but a condition imposed by someone with the leverage to impose it. And the absence of public pressure from law enforcement could mean one of two things. Either they know she is protected and are allowing the situation to develop, or they have not yet identified the force keeping her quiet, which would mean a significant and troubling piece of this investigation remains in the shadows. There is no documented evidence of witness protection in this case. There is no confirmed threat. There is no named individual exerting control over Malia's movements or silence. What exists is a pattern of behavior that doesn't fit neatly into any single explanation, and a law enforcement response has been, perhaps deliberately, perhaps necessarily, almost completely silent on the subject of the mother of the missing children. What that silence means is still unknown. But in a case built almost entirely on the weight of unanswered questions, the silence of the institution investigating the disappearance carries just as much gravity as the silence of the woman who left. Both silences are speaking. Neither one has finished saying what it means. And somewhere between them, the truth about Lily and Jack Sullivan is waiting to be found. Here is what we know with certainty. Lily and Jack Sullivan are still missing. There's been no confirmed proof of life. There's been no confirmed proof of death. There's been no arrest, no charge, no resolution that gives the public, the investigators, or whatever remains of this fractured family any solid ground to stand on. What exists is a case suspended in the unbearable space between hope and grief, held there by unanswered questions and a silence that has grown louder with every passing day. 5 theories, 5 possible architectures for what happened and why. A mother destroyed from the inside by trauma so total that standing in front of cameras became physiologically impossible. A mother who saw or heard something she was too terrified to name, retreating into the role of passive protector while the truth stayed locked inside her. A mother who, in the most devastating version of this story, may have been directly involved in an act that no one in her life saw coming, driven to an unthinkable place by pressures that have been compounding invisibly for years. A mother removed from the picture, either by protective authorities working quietly in the background or by a coercive force within her own circle demanding her silence as the price of something, or something else entirely. Something we haven't named yet, because the silence surrounding this case is still too thick to see through completely. None of these theories have been confirmed. All of them carry weight. All of them leave marks. What they share is this. At the center of each one stand a woman who has not spoken, and around that woman, 2 children remain missing, their names still attached to a case that has not moved into the light. Lily Sullivan, Jack Sullivan, a pink blanket torn and snagged on a tree in the Nova Scotia woods, a forest that was searched by hundreds of people and gave back nothing definitive, a community still waiting, a country that is not forgotten, even as the headlines have drifted toward newer tragedies. Cases like this one carry a particular kind of weight in the public imagination because they collapse the boundary between the unthinkable and the ordinary. The Sullivan home was not a place the world was watching before May 2nd, 2025. It was a quiet life, off-grid, removed from the rhythms of public visibility. And then in a single morning, it became the center of a search that mobilized helicopters, drones, hundreds of volunteers, and the attention of an entire nation. That attention has not produced answers, but it must not produce silence either. Because here is the truth about cases like this one. The ones that get solved, the ones where missing children are found alive weeks or months or even years later, the ones where truth finally surfaces after long stretches of darkness, almost never reach resolution because investigators worked alone. They reach resolution because the public refused to let the names fade. Because someone, somewhere, held on to a piece of information they eventually found the courage to bring forward. Because awareness, sustained and relentless, creates the conditions under which truth becomes possible. That is why this video exists. That is why this community exists. Not to convict anyone without evidence. Not to pile cruelty onto a case already drowning in pain. But to keep the light on, to keep saying the names, to keep asking the questions that deserve answers, even when the answers are slow in coming. If you know anything about what happened to Lily and Jack Sullivan, contact the RCMP immediately. The smallest detail, The fragment of conversation you half remember, the thing you saw and weren't sure mattered, could be the exact piece that breaks this case open. Do not wait. Do not talk yourself out of it. Make the call. And if you are part of this community, if you have watched this far and you feel the weight of what is still unresolved, then do 3 things right now. Like this video so it reaches more people. Share it so the names travel further. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you are here when the next chapter of the story unfolds, because we will not stop until there's an answer. Lily and Jack Sullivan deserve the truth, and we will not let their light go out.